There's something deeply unsettling about the quiet hours before dawn. That stretch of time when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. When darkness wraps around everything like a blanket, and the familiar contours of reality seem just a little bit softer, a little less certain. It's during these hours, when most of humanity sleeps soundly in their beds, that some of the strangest and most terrifying encounters in human history have taken place. Encounters that challenge everything we think we know about our place in the universe, about the nature of reality itself, and about whether we're truly alone in the vast cosmic ocean that surrounds our tiny blue planet. For decades, people from all walks of life have reported experiences that defy conventional explanation. Experiences of being taken against their will by beings that shouldn't exist, transported to places that can't be real, subjected to examinations and procedures that sound like they're pulled from the darkest corners of science fiction. These aren't the ravings of attention seekers or the delusions of troubled minds, although skeptics would have you believe otherwise. These are accounts from everyday people, from farmers and housewives, from police officers and pilots, from children and grandparents, from individuals with nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward with their stories. The phenomenon of alien abduction emerged into public consciousness gradually, building from whispered rumors and isolated incidents into a cultural touchstone that would define an era and reshape how we think about the universe and our place within it. Before the term alien abduction entered the popular lexicon, before the image of large-headed beings with enormous eyes became seared into our collective imagination, there were only scattered reports, fragments of inexplicable experiences that people kept to themselves for fear of ridicule or worse. But as more people began to speak up, as patterns emerged from the chaos of individual testimonies, it became clear that something profoundly strange was happening to ordinary people all over the world. What makes these cases so disturbing isn't just the reported experiences themselves, the physical examinations, the paralysis, the missing time, the strange marks that appear on bodies with no memory of how they got there. It's the aftermath. The way these encounters ripple through lives like stones dropped into still water. The nightmares that plague survivors for years or decades afterward. The relationships that fracture under the weight of experiences that can't be explained or understood. The psychological toll of knowing something happened to you, something real and terrifying, but having the world dismiss it as fantasy or mental illness. The burden of memory, fragmented and disturbing, that refuses to fade with time. Many abductees report similar experiences under hypnosis or through recovered memories. They describe being taken from their homes, often through closed windows or walls, as if the normal rules of physics simply don't apply to these visitors. They speak of examination rooms with harsh lighting and strange instruments, of beings that communicate without speaking, projecting thoughts directly into human minds. They recount procedures that feel invasive and dehumanizing, sample collection from various parts of the body, implants placed beneath the skin, reproductive material taken, or hybrid children shown to confused and terrified human parents. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they describe the indifference of these beings, the cold clinical detachment with which they go about their business, treating human subjects like specimens in some vast cosmic laboratory. The psychological impact of these experiences cannot be overstated. Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist who devoted the later years of his career to studying abduction phenomena, found that his patients exhibited real trauma, the kind that doesn't come from fantasy or imagination. They suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and a host of other psychological symptoms that are typically associated with genuine traumatic experiences. Many struggled with their sense of reality, questioning their own sanity, wondering if they were losing their minds even as they knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that what they experienced was real. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the memories. Others withdrew from society, unable to function in a world that refused to acknowledge their experiences as valid. But these stories persist, passed down and documented, investigated by researchers and dismissed by skeptics, yet never quite fading into obscurity. They form a tapestry of human experience that spans decades and continents, cultures, and backgrounds, linking together thousands of individuals who share something profound and terrifying. Whether you believe these accounts represent genuine extraterrestrial contact, some form of psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely beyond our current understanding, the impact on those who experience them is undeniably real. Tonight, we're going to explore 15 of the most compelling, disturbing, and well-documented cases of alleged alien abduction. These aren't stories chosen for their sensationalism or their entertainment value. Rather, they represent cases that have been investigated thoroughly, that involve multiple witnesses or physical evidence, that have stood up to scrutiny and skeptical examination over years or even decades. They're cases that deserve to be heard and considered, regardless of what ultimate explanation, if any, we might arrive at for what truly happened to these people. As you listen to these accounts, try to imagine yourself in the shoes of these experiencers. Imagine the terror of waking to find strange beings in your bedroom, the helplessness of being unable to move or cry out, the confusion of missing time, of hours vanishing from your life with no memory of where they went, the burden of carrying a secret too strange to share, too real to forget. And perhaps most importantly, imagine the courage it takes to come forward with such a story, knowing you'll be mocked, doubted, and dismissed by most people who hear it. These are their stories of contact, of trauma, of experiences that changed lives forever. Stories that challenge us to expand our understanding of what might be possible, of what might be sharing our universe with us. Stories that, whether literally true or not, speak to something deep in the human psyche, some primal fear or fascination with the unknown that has haunted our species since we first looked up at the stars and wondered what might be looking back. So settle in, dim the lights if you'd like, and prepare yourself for a journey into some of the strangest and most disturbing encounters ever reported. A journey that begins on a quiet road in New Hampshire on a September evening in 1961, when a couple's leisurely drive home from vacation would transform into an experience that would change not just their lives, but the entire landscape of how we think about the possibility of contact with beings from beyond our world. On September 19th, 1961, the night was clear and stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet as Betty and Barney Hill drove south through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. They were tired but content, heading home to Portsmouth after a spontaneous vacation that had taken them to Montreal and Niagara Falls. It had been a much-needed break for the couple, both of whom worked demanding jobs. Barney, an African-American man, worked the night shift at the post office, a job that required him to drive 60 miles each way, while Betty served as a social worker, handling difficult child welfare cases that weighed heavy on her heart. They were also both deeply involved in civil rights work, a passion that consumed much of their free time in an era when their interracial marriage was still illegal in many states. The drive should have been unremarkable, just another stretch of highway leading them back to ordinary life. They'd stopped at a diner in Vermont around 10 in the evening, planning to be home by 2 in the morning. The route was familiar enough, winding through the mountains on empty roads where they might not see another car for miles. But as they drove through the darkness, something caught Betty's attention. Something that would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter their lives and mark the beginning of modern UFO abduction lore. Betty noticed what she first thought was a particularly bright star, or perhaps a planet. But this light behaved strangely, moving in ways that celestial bodies simply don't move. It seemed to be following them, keeping pace with their car as they wound through the mountain roads. At first, Barney was skeptical, suggesting it might be a plane or a satellite. But as they watched, the object's movements became increasingly difficult to explain away. It would dart from one position to another, zigzag across the sky, drop suddenly, and then rise again, all while maintaining a consistent distance from their vehicle. Curious and increasingly uneasy, Barney pulled the car over at a scenic turnout. They got out, Betty carrying a pair of binoculars they'd brought for sightseeing, and stared up at the strange light. Through the binoculars, Betty could see that it wasn't a conventional aircraft at all. The object appeared to be disc-shaped, with rows of windows that glowed with an inner light. She could see figures moving behind those windows, silhouettes that looked vaguely humanoid, but not quite right. She passed the binoculars to Barney, who looked through them with growing alarm. What happened next would become one of the most analyzed moments in UFO history. Barney, driven by a mixture of curiosity and perhaps some need to understand what he was seeing, took the binoculars and walked out into a field, moving closer to the hovering craft. Later, under hypnosis, he would describe what he saw in chilling detail. The craft had descended until it hovered perhaps 75 feet above the ground. Through the windows, he could see beings looking back at him. They weren't human, not even close. Their heads were larger than human heads should be, with skin that seemed almost grayish in the strange light emanating from the craft. Their eyes were enormous, dark, and slanted, and as he watched, one of the beings seemed to look directly at him. In that moment, Barney was seized by an overwhelming terror, a primal fear that something terrible was about to happen to him and Betty. He ran back to the car, shouting at Betty to get in, and they sped away down the highway, desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever that thing was. But the object wasn't finished with them. As they drove, the craft followed, sometimes hovering directly above their car, sometimes off to the side, always maintaining its presence. And then, something strange happened to their memories. The next clear recollection either of them had was of being 35 miles further south than they should have been, with several hours missing from their lives and no explanation for how they'd gotten there, or where the time had gone. When they finally arrived home, it was nearly dawn. Both felt disturbed and confused, unable to shake the feeling that something significant had happened during those lost hours, something their minds refused to let them remember. In the days that followed, strange details began to emerge. Barney's shoes were scuffed in a way that suggested he'd been walking or dragging his feet on rough ground. Betty's dress had been torn at the hemline, and there was a strange pink powder on the fabric that wouldn't brush off and couldn't be identified. Both of their watches had stopped working, the hands frozen at the exact same time. And most disturbing of all, both began to experience vivid, terrifying nightmares. Betty's dreams were particularly detailed and consistent. Night after night, she would wake in a cold sweat, fragments of memory flooding back in the form of dream imagery. In these dreams, she and Barney were stopped on the road by a group of beings. The beings communicated without speaking, their intentions clear despite the absence of words. They were taken from their car, led through a wooded area to a clearing where a craft waited. Inside the craft, they were separated. Betty was placed in a room that looked almost like a medical facility, though the equipment was unlike anything she'd ever seen. She was examined by these beings, who seemed curious about every aspect of her physical form. They took samples of her hair, her skin, her nails. They performed tests that were painful and frightening, particularly one involving a long needle inserted into her abdomen, which the beings seemed to indicate was some kind of pregnancy test, though nothing like any medical procedure she'd experienced before. During this examination, Betty attempted to communicate with what seemed to be the leader of these beings. She asked where they came from, and the leader showed her a star map, a three-dimensional projection of stars and connecting lines that meant nothing to her at the time. She tried to take a book from the examination room as proof of her experience, but the leader, after initially agreeing, ultimately refused, saying it would prove nothing and might cause problems. Throughout the ordeal, Betty's fear was tempered by curiosity and a kind of pragmatic acceptance. These beings didn't seem hostile exactly, just clinical, going about their business with the detached efficiency of scientists conducting an experiment. Barney's experience, as it would later emerge under hypnosis, was more traumatic. He described being taken into a different part of the craft, where his examination was more invasive and terrifying. The beings seemed particularly interested in his reproductive system, a focus that left him feeling violated and humiliated. Unlike Betty, who maintained some level of conversation with her examiners, Barney was mostly kept in a paralyzed state, conscious but unable to move or speak, forced to endure the procedures while helpless to resist or even protest. The beings communicated with him telepathically, telling him not to be afraid, but their assurances did little to ease his terror. He described their faces as almost hypnotic, particularly their eyes, which seemed to bore into his mind, pulling at his thoughts and memories in ways that felt like mental violation. After both examinations were complete, the Hills were led back to their car. The beings performed what can only be described as a memory wipe, attempting to erase the couple's recollection of the encounter. Betty and Barney were told to drive away and not look back, that they would remember nothing of what had happened, and for a while the block seemed to work, leaving only that strange gap in their memory and the disturbing dreams that plagued Betty's sleep. But Betty wasn't content to let the matter rest. She began researching UFOs, spending hours at the library reading everything she could find about unidentified flying objects and close encounters. She filed a report with the Air Force and with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a civilian UFO research group. As she delved deeper into the subject, she found that others had reported similar experiences, though few had come forward publicly. The similarity of these accounts to her own dreams was both validating and deeply disturbing. The nightmares and anxiety eventually drove the Hills to seek professional help. They began seeing Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston psychiatrist who was well respected in his field, though he had no particular interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial phenomena. Dr. Simon's approach was cautious and professional. He used hypnotic regression as a therapeutic tool to help his patients access repressed memories and deal with anxiety. But he made no promises about what they might discover. Over the course of months, in separate sessions to ensure they couldn't influence each other's accounts, he guided both Betty and Barney back to that night in 1961. What emerged under hypnosis was remarkable for its consistency and detail. Despite being hypnotized separately, with neither knowing what the other had said, their accounts matched in fundamental ways. Both described being stopped on the road by a group of beings approximately 5 feet tall, with large heads and enormous eyes. Both recalled being taken into a craft and subjected to physical examinations. Both described the interior of the craft in similar terms, with curved walls and unusual lighting, and both recounted the fear and helplessness they felt during the experience, the sense of being utterly at the mercy of beings whose motivations and nature they couldn't begin to understand. Dr. Simon remained professionally skeptical about the literal truth of the Hills' accounts, suggesting that the memories might have been influenced by Betty's dreams, and that the hypnotic sessions might have reinforced those dream images rather than recovering genuine memories. But he was convinced that his patients believed their experience was real, and that they had suffered genuine psychological trauma from whatever had actually occurred that night. The fear and distress they exhibited during the hypnotic sessions was not fabricated. These were people reliving something that felt absolutely real to them, something that had left deep psychological scars. The Hill case became public in 1965 when their story was published in a Boston newspaper, and later in a book by John G. Fuller called The Interrupted Journey. The response was overwhelming and divided. Some people embraced the Hills account as proof of extraterrestrial visitation, while others dismissed it as fantasy or attention-seeking. The Hills themselves never sought publicity and seemed deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight their story attracted. They continued to maintain that their experience was real until their deaths. Barney in 1969 from a cerebral hemorrhage at just 46 years old, and Betty in 2004 at age 85. The significance of the Hill case cannot be overstated. It established many of the elements that would become standard in later abduction accounts. The gray beings with large heads and eyes, the medical examinations, the missing time, the psychological trauma, all of these features would appear again and again in subsequent reports from people all over the world. Skeptics argue this is evidence that later claimants were simply copying the Hills' story, while believers suggest it indicates a genuine pattern of extraterrestrial activity. Regardless of which interpretation one accepts, the Hill case opened a door in public consciousness, making it possible for others to come forward with their own stories and beginning a conversation about alien abduction that continues to this day. The physical evidence from the case remains tantalizing but inconclusive. The damaged dress and the stopped watches have never been fully explained. The star map Betty claimed to have seen was later analyzed by an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish, who spent years creating three-dimensional models of nearby star systems and eventually claimed to have found a match that pointed to the Zeta Reticuli system. While this interpretation has been disputed by other astronomers and scientists, it added another layer to the mystery surrounding the Hills' experience. What remains clear is that Betty and Barney Hill were forever changed by what happened to them that September night. They were ordinary people going about their ordinary lives when they encountered something that shattered their sense of reality and left them struggling to understand an experience that defied everything they thought they knew about the world. Their courage in coming forward, in sharing their story despite the skepticism and ridicule they faced, paved the way for countless others who would later report similar experiences. And their case stands as a watershed moment in the history of UFO phenomena, the point at which alien abduction moved from whispered rumor to documented, investigated claim. But the Hill case, as groundbreaking as it wasn't actually the first reported alien abduction. That distinction belongs to a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas Boas, whose experience predated the Hills by several years, though it wouldn't become widely known outside of Brazil until much later. Antonio's story is different from most abduction accounts, disturbing in unique ways that set it apart from the typical pattern, and it raises questions that remain difficult to answer even decades later. In October of 1957, Antonio Villas Boas was a 23-year-old farmer working his family's land in the state of Minas Gerais in rural Brazil. He was educated enough to read and write, came from a family that owned their land and equipment, and had no history of mental illness or attention-seeking behavior. He was, by all accounts, a practical young man focused on the hard work of farming, someone who would have had little reason to fabricate a bizarre story that would bring him nothing but trouble and embarrassment. On the night of October 15th, Antonio had a strange experience that served as a precursor to what would come. He was in his bedroom when he noticed a bright light shining through the window shutters. Opening them, he saw what he described as a fluorescent glow illuminating the entire farmyard. The light moved across the yard, sliding along the roof of the house, seemingly coming from above. Frightened and confused, Antonio watched for about 15 minutes before the light simply vanished, leaving him shaken, but with no explanation for what he'd witnessed. The next night, he was plowing a field with his brother when they both saw a bright red light in the sky. It looked nothing like a star or a plane, and it appeared to be moving in their direction. Antonio's brother refused to look at it for long, frightened by the strangeness of the object, and eventually convinced Antonio to head back to the house. But Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening, that these lights were somehow connected to something bigger than he understood. Then came the night of October 16th, the night that would change Antonio's life forever. He was working alone, plowing a field at night to avoid the brutal heat of the Brazilian sun during the day. The night was clear, and he worked by the light of his tractor, the engine's familiar rumble a comforting sound in the darkness. But around 1 a.m, his sense of normalcy was shattered when he noticed a red star in the sky, brighter than any star should be, and it was growing larger, coming closer. Within moments, Antonio realized this was no star. The object was egg-shaped with a spinning top or dome on its upper surface, and it was descending directly toward him. The glow it emitted was so bright, it illuminated the entire field. As the craft landed nearby, its light shifted through various colors, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow across the plowed earth. Antonio, terrified, tried to drive away on his tractor, but after traveling only a short distance, the engine died and the lights went out. He leaped from the tractor and tried to run, but he'd taken only a few steps before he was grabbed. The being that seized him was approximately 5 feet tall, wearing what looked like gray coveralls and a helmet. Its eyes were small and blue, but the most unsettling aspect was that it didn't speak in any recognizable language. Instead, it made sounds like barks or yelps, high-pitched noises that seemed to serve as some form of communication. Antonio struggled, but 3 more beings quickly appeared, and together they overpowered him, dragging him toward the craft despite his desperate attempts to break free. He tried to shout for help, but there was no one around for miles, and the beings seemed entirely unconcerned with his resistance. Once inside the craft, Antonio was forcibly stripped of his clothing. The beings covered him from head to toe with a strange gel-like substance that felt cold and slippery against his skin. Then they led him through a doorway that had strange red symbols written above it. Antonio, even in his terror, tried to memorize these symbols, understanding instinctively that any details he could remember might be important later. The symbols looked nothing like any writing system he'd ever seen, angular and alien in their construction. In a semicircular room, the beings took samples of Antonio's blood. They did this by making a small incision under his chin and collecting the blood in what looked like a chalice or cup made of material Antonio couldn't identify. The process was painful and humiliating, and throughout it, the beings maintained their strange barking communication, apparently discussing what they were doing in their incomprehensible language. After the blood collection, Antonio was left alone in another room. This is when things became even stranger and more disturbing. Some kind of gray smoke or gas began pumping into the room through vents. The substance made Antonio violently ill, causing him to vomit into a corner of the room. He felt nauseous and dizzy, overwhelmed by the combined effects of fear, the strange gas, and the alien environment he found himself in. He had no idea what was happening or what these beings intended to do with him, and the uncertainty was almost worse than any specific threat might have been. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about half an hour, one of the beings returned. But this one was different. This being was female, distinctly so, and she was naked. She was the same height as the other beings, approximately 5 feet tall, but her proportions were more human-like, more familiar. Her face was triangular, with a pointed chin and large slanted eyes that were a striking blue-green color. Her hair was long and white, almost platinum blonde, parted in the middle and reaching to her shoulders. But her underarm hair and pubic hair were bright red, a detail so specific and unusual that it would be hard to dismiss as invented. What happened next has made Antonio Villas Boas's case one of the most controversial and often dismissed abduction accounts in UFO history. According to Antonio, the female being made it clear through gestures and what he interpreted as telepathic suggestion that she intended to have sexual relations with him. At first, he was repulsed by the idea, still terrified and nauseated from the gas. But he found himself responding physically despite his mental resistance. The female being did not kiss him, but instead bit or nipped at his chin during their encounter. Throughout the experience, Antonio reported feeling manipulated, as if his physical responses were being controlled or enhanced by some means he didn't understand. When it was over, the female being seemed satisfied. She rubbed her belly and pointed upward toward the sky, and Antonio understood this as an indication that she would bear his child and raise it elsewhere, among her own people. The implication was clear and deeply disturbing. Whatever had just occurred had been purposeful, a breeding experiment designed to create some kind of hybrid offspring. The female being smiled at him, but there was no warmth in that smile, just the satisfaction of someone who had completed an assigned task. After this, Antonio was finally allowed to dress and was escorted on a tour of parts of the craft, though he was prevented from entering certain areas. The beings seemed proud of their vessel showing it off like someone might show a guest around their home. Antonio saw what looked like a control room or bridge with equipment he couldn't begin to understand, displays that might have been navigational instruments, and controls whose purpose he could only guess at. The tour felt surreal after what he'd just experienced, as if the beings were completely unaware of or unconcerned about the traumatic nature of his experience. Finally, after approximately 4 hours inside the craft, Antonio was led back outside. The beings retrieved the shirt he'd torn in his initial struggle, now in tatters, and handed it to him. One of the beings pointed at the sky, making gestures that Antonio interpreted as instructions or perhaps explanations about where they came from, though he couldn't really understand what was being communicated. Then they simply went back into their craft. The door closed, and the object rose into the air. It hovered briefly, the strange lights shifting and pulsing, and then shot away into the night sky at impossible speed, leaving Antonio alone in the plowed field with his dead tractor and his shattered sense of reality. The physical aftermath of Antonio's experience was immediate and severe. He began suffering from nausea and extreme weakness. He developed terrible headaches that wouldn't go away, and strange lesions appeared on his skin, particularly on his arms and hands, appearing without any corresponding bruising or indication of how they'd been caused. His eyes became sensitive to light, and he experienced insomnia and night terrors. Eventually, he contacted a journalist named Jose Martins, who had placed an advertisement seeking people with UFO experiences. Martins, recognizing the potential significance of Antonio's claims, put him in touch with Dr. Olavo Fontes of Brazil's National School of Medicine. Dr. Fontes examined Antonio thoroughly and was surprised by what he found. The young farmer exhibited symptoms consistent with radiation exposure, though from what source the doctor couldn't determine. The lesions on his skin, the nausea, the weakness, all pointed to some form of mild radiation sickness. But there was no conventional explanation for how Antonio could have been exposed to such radiation while working alone in a field. Dr. Fontes documented everything carefully, recognizing that this case was extraordinary and likely to attract significant attention and skepticism. The story of Antonio Villas Boas remained relatively unknown outside of Brazil for several years. It wasn't widely published in English-language UFO literature until the early 1960s, and by that time, the Betty and Barney Hill case had already captured public attention. Some researchers saw the timing as suspicious, suggesting that Antonio might have copied elements from other stories that had appeared in Brazilian magazines. But others pointed out that Antonio's account was documented and investigated well before the Hill case became public knowledge, and that many of its unique elements, particularly the sexual encounter, were unlike anything in the typical UFO literature of the time. What makes Antonio's case particularly significant is that he never wavered from his story. He went on to become a lawyer, married, had children, and lived a normal, respectable life. He could have easily recanted his claims at any point, could have dismissed the whole thing as a youthful misunderstanding or a moment of temporary insanity. But he never did. Until his death in 1991, Antonio Villas Boas maintained that what happened to him in that field was real, that he had been taken aboard an extraterrestrial craft and forced into an encounter that served some kind of breeding purpose for these beings. The sexual nature of Antonio's experience has made many researchers uncomfortable, and the case is often downplayed or dismissed as less credible than other abduction accounts. There's something too human about it too terrestrial in its motivations that makes it difficult for people to accept. But if we take Antonio's account at face value, it raises profound and disturbing questions about the nature and intent of these alleged extraterrestrial encounters. Were these beings simply conducting biological experiments? Were they attempting to create hybrid offspring for reasons we can't begin to understand? Or was something else entirely going on? Something that our limited human perspective prevents us from grasping? While the Villas Boas and Hill cases would eventually become famous in UFO circles, there was another encounter that occurred even earlier, in 1955, that captured the American imagination in a different way. This case didn't involve a traditional abduction in the sense of being taken aboard a craft, but it featured elements that were equally terrifying and that introduced the world to what would become one of the most enduring images in UFO lore: the little green men that would populate countless B-movies and science fiction stories for decades to come. The evening of August 21st, 1955, started as an ordinary summer night in Kelly, Kentucky, a tiny hamlet of houses scattered near the larger town of Hopkinsville in the rural farmland of Christian County. The Sutton family and their visiting relatives, the Taylors, had gathered at the Sutton farmhouse for a typical evening. The house was small and unpainted, sitting on property that lacked many modern conveniences. There was no running water, requiring the family to draw from a well in the yard. No telephone connected them to the outside world. No radio or television provided entertainment or news. The Suttons were simple farming people, struggling to make ends meet, isolated from much of the modern world by both geography and circumstance. Billy Ray Taylor, who was visiting with his wife, went out to the well around 7 in the evening to get some water. As he stood there in the warm August air, he noticed something strange in the sky. A bright object was moving overhead, brighter than any star or plane he'd ever seen, and it appeared to be descending. Billy Ray watched, transfixed, as this object came lower, apparently landing somewhere in a gully beyond the house. The object glowed with its own light, casting an eerie illumination across the landscape, and then it seemed to settle to the ground. Excited and a bit frightened, Billy Ray ran back to the house to tell the others what he'd seen. But when he described the glowing object landing in the distance, the family was skeptical. Many assumed he'd simply seen a meteor or shooting star, and they dismissed his claims with good-natured teasing. So the evening continued as planned, the family chatting and spending time together, putting Billy Ray's sighting out of their minds as they went about their ordinary activities. But then, around 8 in the evening, things took a turn toward the truly bizarre. The family dog, which had been outside, began barking frantically, with the kind of agitated sound that indicated it had sensed something wrong, something threatening. Billy Ray and Elmer Lucky Sutton grabbed their guns, a 12-gauge shotgun and a .22 rifle, and went to the door to see what was disturbing the dog. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Approaching the house was a creature unlike anything either man had seen before. It stood about 3.5 feet tall, but its proportions were all wrong for a human child. The head was enormous and almost perfectly round, sitting atop a thin neck that looked too fragile to support it. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to the ground, and ended in what looked like talons or claws. The creature's skin seemed to have a silvery sheen to it, almost metallic, and its eyes, those terrible eyes, glowed with a yellowish light that was clearly visible even at a distance. The creature appeared to be floating rather than walking, moving toward the house with its hands raised, almost as if in greeting or surrender. But the gesture did nothing to reassure the terrified men. Billy Ray and Lucky opened fire, the shotgun blast hitting the creature's center mass. To their shock and horror, the creature simply flipped over backward and scurried away, apparently unhurt by the shot. It made no sound of pain, showed no sign of injury, and moved with an unsettling, inhuman speed as it retreated into the darkness. This was not the end of the encounter, but merely the beginning of what would become a night of absolute terror for everyone in the Sutton farmhouse. Soon after the first creature disappeared, another appeared at a window, peering into the house with those same glowing yellow eyes. Again, the men fired, shattering the window, but apparently not harming the creature, which simply vanished from view. Then another appeared in a different window, and another at the door. The creatures seemed to be surrounding the house, appearing at windows and doors, on the roof, in the yard, always moving with that strange floating gait, always with those glowing eyes fixed on the terrified family inside. For nearly 4 hours, this siege continued. The men would fire at a creature, seemingly hit it dead on, and watch it tumble away only to reappear minutes later at another location, apparently unharmed. The creatures made no aggressive moves to enter the house, but their constant presence, their persistence, was psychologically devastating. The women and children huddled in the back rooms, crying and praying, while the men took turns watching different windows and doors, trying to protect the family from these inexplicable visitors. The children later described the creatures as looking like goblins or gremlins from fairy tales, but more frightening because they were real. Grandma Sutton, the family matriarch, clutched a Bible and prayed throughout the ordeal, convinced they were under demonic attack. The sheer strangeness of what was happening was in some ways worse than any conventional threat would have been. If these had been human intruders, there would have been some framework for understanding, some way to predict their behavior and plan accordingly. But these creatures operated by rules the family didn't understand, seemed impervious to weapons that should have killed or at least injured them, and showed a persistence that suggested they were here for some specific purpose, though what that purpose might be remained terrifyingly unclear. Finally, around 11 at night, there was a lull in the activity. The creatures seemed to withdraw, and no new ones appeared at the windows. The family seized this opportunity to flee. All 11 of them, 5 adults and 7 children, piled into 2 vehicles and raced toward Hopkinsville, heading for the police station to report what had happened. They arrived at the station around 11:15, erupting through the doors in a state of obvious terror and agitation. The duty officer, confronted with 11 frightened people, all talking at once about creatures attacking their house, immediately called for backup. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Chief Russell Greenwell, 4 city police officers, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police from nearby Fort Campbell all converged on the Sutton farm. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure what they might find. Some of the officers suspected a shootout between rival families, or perhaps an armed robbery gone wrong. Others wondered if the whole thing might be some kind of hoax, but all of them took the Suttons' terror seriously. Whatever these people believed had happened, it had genuinely traumatized them. When the large contingent of law enforcement arrived at the farmhouse, they found exactly what one would expect to find after a prolonged gun battle. The house was riddled with bullet holes, glass was shattered, the walls were peppered with shot. But they found no bodies, no blood, no physical evidence of the creatures the family described. The officers searched the property thoroughly, using flashlights to sweep through the fields and checking every outbuilding, they found nothing that could explain what had terrified the Sutton family so badly. However, several officers noted details that were hard to dismiss. There were scratch marks on the screens that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. The family's dog was cowering under the house and refused to come out, even for its owners. And there was a strange, silvery substance in patches around the yard that no one could identify. Perhaps most tellingly, the officers noticed an unusual luminescence in a gully beyond the house. A faint glow that didn't seem to come from any natural source. By the time they investigated that area more thoroughly, the glow had faded, leaving behind nothing they could document or collect as evidence. Chief Greenwell, after hours of investigation, finally had to admit to the family that while something had clearly happened, they couldn't find any evidence of what it was. He apologized for not being able to help further and advised them to keep their doors and windows secured. Then the entire contingent of law enforcement packed up and left, leaving the traumatized family to face the remainder of the night alone. But the creatures weren't finished. After the police left and the family, exhausted and terrified, tried to settle down for the night, the creatures returned. Lucky Sutton saw one peering in through a window around 3 a.m. The family spent the rest of the night awake and armed, prepared to defend themselves if the creatures tried to enter the house. But as dawn approached, the visitors finally withdrew for good, vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. The next day, the story hit the newspapers. The Kentucky New Era ran the story under a sensational headline, and reporters began descending on the Sutton farm. The family, unprepared for the media circus their report had unleashed, found themselves besieged by a different kind of intruder: journalists, curiosity seekers, UFO researchers, and skeptics, all demanding answers, photographs, interviews. Some people came to offer support and validation. Others came to mock and ridicule. The farm became a tourist attraction practically overnight, with cars lining the road and strangers tramping through the fields looking for evidence of the creatures. The Suttons never changed their story. They never sought publicity or tried to profit from their experience. In fact, the attention was deeply unwelcome, disrupting their lives and subjecting them to ridicule from neighbors and strangers alike. Several family members eventually moved away, unable to cope with the constant intrusion and mockery. But none of them, in all the years that followed, ever recanted their account of what happened that August night. The incident was investigated by the Air Force as part of Project Blue Book, their official program for investigating UFO sightings. The Air Force conclusion was dismissive. The entire incident was classified as a hoax, with no further comment or investigation. They offered no explanation for how or why a poor farming family would perpetrate such a hoax, what they might hope to gain from it, or how they managed to convince themselves so thoroughly that even hardened police officers believed they'd experienced genuine trauma. Skeptics have offered various explanations over the years. The most popular theory is that the family encountered a pair of great horned owls, which are nocturnal, aggressive when defending territory, and have glowing eyes when caught in bright light. Owls can appear larger than they are in poor lighting conditions, and their aggressive diving attacks might be interpreted as hostile intent by frightened people. The theory suggests that Billy Ray's earlier sighting of a landing object was actually a meteor, and the combination of the meteor and the aggressive owls created a perfect storm of misidentification and fear. But this explanation has problems. Great horned owls, while impressive birds, are not bulletproof. They don't glow with their own light. They don't leave scratch marks on window screens. at least not the kind of marks the police observed. And it's difficult to imagine experienced farmers and hunters, people who had lived in rural Kentucky all their lives and would have encountered owls countless times, misidentifying these familiar birds so completely, especially over a 4-hour period with multiple clear sightings. Other skeptics have suggested the family was drunk on moonshine, though this theory seems even less plausible, given that the police officers who interviewed them immediately after the incident reported no signs of intoxication. The most dismissive skeptics simply write the whole thing off as an elaborate hoax or shared delusion, though they can't explain what would motivate such a hoax, or how the family maintained it so consistently for decades without ever breaking character. The Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter, as it came to be known, entered popular culture in a way that few UFO cases have. The description of small, large-headed creatures with glowing eyes became the template for countless depictions of aliens in movies, television shows, and books. The term "little green men," which journalists applied to the creatures, despite the family never actually describing them as green, became synonymous with extraterrestrial visitors. The case has been referenced in everything from serious UFO documentaries to comedy sketches, and the town of Hopkinsville eventually embraced its strange claim to fame, holding an annual Little Green Men Festival that celebrates the encounter. The early 1970s marked a period of intense UFO activity across the United States, a wave of sightings and encounters that seemed to reach a crescendo in the fall of 1973. It was during this surge of activity that one of the most well-documented and disturbing alien abduction cases on record took place in a small shipyard town on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. On the evening of October 11, 1973, 2 men were fishing from an abandoned pier on the Pascagoula River. Charles Hickson, 42 years old, and Calvin Parker, 19, were co-workers at a local shipyard, enjoying a quiet evening of fishing after their work shift ended. The location they'd chosen was isolated, a good spot for catching fish without being disturbed by other anglers. The evening was calm and pleasant, the kind of perfect autumn night when sitting by the water with a fishing pole seems like the most natural thing in the world. Around 9 in the evening, both men became aware of a strange noise, a whirring or whizzing sound that seemed to come from above and behind them. Turning to look, they saw flashing blue lights reflecting off the surface of the river. And then they saw the source, an oval-shaped craft, approximately 30 to 40 feet across and 8 to 10 feet high, hovering over the water behind them. The object was not quite egg-shaped, more of a flattened oval, and it emitted a blue light that pulsed in a hypnotic pattern. As the 2 men watched, frozen with a mixture of fear and disbelief, a door or opening appeared in the side of the craft. 3 beings emerged, or rather, they floated out, because these creatures weren't walking. They were moving through the air as if gravity had no effect on them at all. The beings moved toward Charlie and Calvin with disturbing purpose, gliding a few feet off the ground, their movements smooth and inhuman. Charlie Hickson later described the beings in remarkable detail. They were approximately 5 feet tall, with grayish, wrinkled skin that looked almost like it had been cured or treated somehow, giving it a leathery texture. Their bodies were roughly humanoid in shape, but distorted, with features that struck Hickson as almost robotic, despite clearly being organic. Where humans have hands and feet, these beings had something more like lobster claws or pincers, rounded appendages with no visible fingers or toes. They had no visible neck, their heads seeming to sit directly on their torso. But most disturbing were the areas where eyes should be. Not proper eyes, but slits, dark and expressionless, that gave no indication of what, if anything, the creatures might be thinking or feeling. Young Calvin Parker, witnessing these beings approaching, fainted almost immediately, his 19-year-old mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Charlie remained conscious but paralyzed, unable to move his arms or legs, unable to cry out or run. He felt himself being lifted, supported not by hands grabbing him, but by some force he couldn't see, as if the air itself had solidified around him and was carrying him toward the craft. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, neither painful nor comfortable, just profoundly wrong in a way that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and trigger some primal terror buried deep in his evolutionary past. Charlie was floated into the craft, with the unconscious Calvin being transported in a similar fashion behind him. Inside, the craft was unlike any human-built vehicle Charlie had ever seen. The walls curved smoothly and seemed to emit light from their very surface, rather than from distinct light fixtures. The air had a strange quality, hard to breathe, with an odd smell that Charlie couldn't quite identify, but would never forget. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, just alien, wrong, not the kind of air that human lungs were meant to process. Once inside, Charlie found himself in a large room. The beings positioned him in midair, still held by that unseen force, unable to move but able to see and hear everything around him. Then something that looked like a large mechanical eye or scanning device moved around him, floating just as the beings did, seemingly examining every inch of his body without actually touching him. The eye moved slowly, deliberately, stopping at various points on Charlie's body, as if recording data or taking readings. Despite his terror, part of Charlie's mind remained analytical, trying to understand what was happening, trying to memorize details that might make sense later, even if they made no sense now. The examination, if that's what it was, lasted about 20 minutes. During this time, Charlie caught glimpses of Calvin in another area of the craft, still unconscious and being subjected to what appeared to be a similar process. Charlie wanted to call out to the younger man to offer some reassurance, but he couldn't move his mouth, couldn't make his vocal cords respond to his desperate mental commands. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the examination was over. The beings moved Charlie back toward the opening in the craft, still using that invisible force to support and transport him. They returned Calvin as well, his unconscious body floating beside Charlie's paralyzed form. And then they were deposited back on the pier where they'd been fishing, as if these beings were simply returning borrowed items to their proper places. The craft rose into the air, its blue lights pulsing one final time, and then shot away into the night sky at a speed that defied physics as Charlie understood them. As soon as the craft was gone, the paralysis left Charlie's body. He dropped to his knees, suddenly able to move again, and turned to check on Calvin. The younger man was starting to come around, confused and terrified, with no clear memory of what had just happened, but with a deep, instinctive knowledge that something terrible had occurred. For several minutes, the two men simply stayed there on the pier, too shocked to move, trying to process what they'd experienced. Charlie's first instinct was to keep quiet, to say nothing about what had happened, and try to convince himself it had been some kind of shared hallucination. But as the initial shock began to wear off, both men realized they needed to report what had happened, if only to ensure that whatever those things were, someone in authority would know about them. They initially went to the local newspaper office, thinking that journalists might be interested in their story and could help them figure out what to do next. But when they arrived, they found the office closed for the night, so instead they drove to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, arriving at the station around 10:30 that evening, just over an hour after their ordeal had ended. Captain Glenn Ryder was the duty officer when Charlie and Calvin stumbled into the station. Both men were visibly shaken, speaking rapidly and not always coherently as they tried to explain what had happened. Ryder's first thought was that the men might have harmed someone, perhaps had an accident while fishing that resulted in an injury or death, and were making up this incredible story to cover for whatever had really occurred. He could smell alcohol on Charlie's breath, though Charlie explained he'd had a few drinks after the encounter to steady his nerves, not before. But as Ryder listened, watching the men's body language and the genuine terror in their eyes, he began to think that something real had happened to them, even if that something wasn't what they believed it to be. These weren't men trying to pull a hoax or seeking attention. These were frightened people who had experienced something that had shaken them to their core. Ryder made a decision that would prove crucial to the case. He told Charlie and Calvin he believed them and wanted to help, but he needed to ask them some follow-up questions. He put the two men in an interrogation room and left them alone, telling them he'd be back shortly. What the men didn't know was that Ryder had activated a hidden recording device, hoping to catch them contradicting themselves or discussing how to keep their story straight if this was indeed some kind of elaborate hoax. The tape that resulted from this secret recording is chilling to listen to even decades later. Rather than two hoaxers congratulating themselves on fooling the police or trying to coordinate their lies, the tape captured two traumatized men trying to understand what had happened to them. Charlie can be heard praying, his voice breaking with emotion, asking God to help them and protect them from whatever those things were. Calvin is audibly crying, repeating over and over that he doesn't understand what happened, that he's never been so scared in his life. At one point, Charlie tells Calvin, "It scared me to death too, son. You can't get over it in a lifetime." When Captain Ryder listened to this tape, any doubts he might have had about the men's sincerity vanished. These weren't hoaxers. These were people who had experienced something traumatic, something that had genuinely terrified them. He returned to the interrogation room and told Charlie and Calvin that he believed something had happened to them, though he couldn't say what. He took their official statements, documented everything they reported, and then released them to go home, though he suggested they might want to see a doctor given the ordeal they'd been through. The story was in the local newspaper the next day, October 12th. By the afternoon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press and United Press International wire services, and suddenly Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker were national news. Their quiet Mississippi town was overrun with reporters, UFO researchers, skeptics, and curiosity seekers, all demanding interviews and information. The two men, who had just wanted to fish in peace, found themselves at the center of a media circus that threatened to overwhelm them completely. The U.S. Air Force sent personnel from Keesler Air Force Base to investigate. The men were examined for radiation exposure and cleared. The Air Force took their statements, but offered no official conclusion about what might have happened. Meanwhile, prominent UFO researchers descended on Pascagoula, including J. Allen Hynek, a respected astronomer who served as the scientific consultant for the Air Force's Project Blue Book, and James Harder, a civil engineer and prominent ufologist. Both men interviewed Charlie and Calvin separately and came away convinced that the men had experienced something extraordinary. Dr. Hynek, in particular, found the case compelling. He noted that Charlie and Calvin's accounts matched in all the essential details despite being interviewed separately. He observed that their emotional reactions were consistent with genuine trauma, not with people trying to maintain a fabricated story. And he was impressed by the specific, unusual details of their account. The pincers instead of hands, the floating rather than walking, the scanning eye device. All details that didn't match the typical UFO encounter narrative and thus were less likely to have been copied from other sources. The case also faced its share of skeptics. Philip J. Klass, a prominent UFO debunker, suggested that the men might have been drunk and mistaken something mundane for an alien craft, or that they'd fabricated the entire story for attention or money. But Klass couldn't explain away the secret recording, which clearly showed two terrified men who believed their experience was real, nor could he provide a plausible alternative explanation for what might have actually happened, if not an alien encounter. Charlie and Calvin both agreed to take polygraph tests. The results were complicated. Charlie passed his polygraph according to most interpretations, with the examiner concluding that he appeared to be telling the truth as he believed it. Calvin's test was less conclusive, though this was attributed to his extreme emotional distress rather than any indication of deception. The young man was so traumatized by the experience that he could barely speak about it without breaking down, which made getting clear physiological readings difficult. In the weeks and months that followed, dozens of other people in the Pascagoula area came forward to report UFO sightings from the same night as Charlie and Calvin's encounter. Many described seeing strange lights over the river or unusual aircraft moving through the sky. While none of these other witnesses reported being abducted, the volume of sightings seemed to corroborate that something unusual had been happening in the area that night. The experience devastated Calvin Parker. The young man retreated from public life almost immediately, refusing most interview requests and trying to return to normalcy, though the memories and trauma made that impossible. He would struggle for decades with anxiety and fear related to the experience, always reluctant to discuss what had happened, always uncomfortable with the attention the case continued to receive. Charlie Hickson, older and perhaps more emotionally resilient, took a different path. He began giving interviews and lectures about his experience, appearing on talk shows and at UFO conferences. He wrote a book about the encounter and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened and why. He never wavered from his account, maintaining until his death in 2011 that every detail he'd reported was true, that he and Calvin had been taken aboard an alien craft and examined by beings from another world. Calvin remained silent about the incident for decades, only beginning to speak publicly again in recent years. In 2018, he published his own book about the experience, providing his perspective for the first time since those initial interviews in 1973. In his account, Calvin confirmed all the essential details of Charlie's story and added his own traumatic memories, including fragmentary recollections of the time he'd been unconscious inside the craft, memories that had come back to him in nightmares over the years. In 2019, a historical marker was dedicated at the site of the alleged abduction, recognizing the Pascagoula case as one of the best documented alien encounter incidents in history. Calvin attended the unveiling, along with Charlie's family, and spoke about how much the recognition meant to him, how validating it felt to have his experience acknowledged officially rather than dismissed or mocked. He died in 2023, taking with him whatever additional details might have remained locked in his memory. While the Pascagoula case was unfolding in Mississippi, Another extraordinary encounter was taking place in Arizona, one that would become arguably the most famous alien abduction case in American history, eventually inspiring a Hollywood film and cementing the name Travis Walton in the annals of UFO lore. On November 5, 1975, Travis Walton was a 22-year-old logger working with a crew of 6 other men in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest near Snowflake, Arizona. The crew had been working hard to fulfill a contract for the U.S. Forest Service, and on that particular day, they'd worked late into the evening, trying to meet their deadline. As darkness fell, the 7 men piled into a single truck, driven by crew boss Mike Rogers for the drive back to town. They were traveling along a remote Forest Service road when one of the men spotted something strange through the trees. A light, bright and unusual, was glowing in a clearing just off the road. Mike slowed the truck, and all 7 men peered through the windshield, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. What emerged into full view as they rounded a curve was something that shouldn't have been there, a large disc-shaped object hovering silently about 15 feet above the ground. The craft was approximately 15 to 20 feet in diameter, gold or amber in color, and it emitted a glow that lit up the entire clearing. Most of the men's first instinct was to get away, to drive past this inexplicable thing as quickly as possible and put distance between themselves and whatever it was. But Travis Walton had a different reaction. Whether out of curiosity, bravery, or simple disbelief, he told Mike to stop the truck, open the door, and started walking toward the hovering object. His co-workers yelled at him to come back, to get back in the truck, but Travis kept walking, drawn by some combination of fascination and disbelief. He approached to within perhaps 20 or 30 feet of the craft, close enough to see details of its structure, the smooth surface that seemed almost organic in its perfection, the complete absence of any visible seams or rivets, the way the light emanated from the craft itself, rather than from any external source. He stood there, looking up at this impossible thing, and later would describe feeling an odd mixture of awe and terror, his rational mind insisting this couldn't be real, even as his senses reported undeniable physical presence. Then the craft began to make a sound, a deep thrumming that Travis could feel in his chest as much as hear with his ears. The object started to wobble slightly, and Travis, his survival instincts finally kicking in, realized he might be in danger and began to back away. But before he could retreat more than a few steps, the craft released a blue-green beam of light that struck Travis directly in the chest. The 6 men watching from the truck described what happened next in horrifyingly consistent detail. The beam of light hit Travis and lifted him off his feet, his body arching backward as if he'd been hit with a massive electrical shock. He seemed to float for a moment in the beam, his arms flung outward, and then he crashed to the ground, landing hard on the forest floor. The craft made another sound, a louder, more intense vibration, and the men in the truck, convinced they'd just watched Travis die, panicked. Mike Rogers threw the truck into gear and sped away, the other men screaming at him to go faster, to get them away from whatever that thing was. They drove perhaps a quarter mile before the panic began to subside enough for rational thought to return. They stopped the truck and sat there, shaking, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. And then guilt set in. They'd left Travis behind, their friend and co-worker, left him lying on the ground beneath that terrible craft. They had to go back. They had to help him, or at least recover his body. So Mike turned the truck around, and they drove back toward the clearing, all 6 men dreading what they might find. But when they reached the spot where Travis had been struck down, there was nothing. The craft was gone. Travis was gone. There was no body, no blood, no sign that anything had happened there at all beyond some disturbed dirt where Travis had fallen. The men searched the immediate area, calling out Travis's name, but there was no response, nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night and the occasional beam from their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Realizing they were in over their heads, the 6 men drove to Heber, the nearest town, and reported what had happened to the police. The police, confronted with 6 agitated men, reporting that their friend had been struck by a beam from a UFO, were immediately suspicious. This sounded like a murder cover story, a fantastic tale being used to explain the disappearance of a man who had probably been killed in some dispute among the crew. They contacted the Navajo County Sheriff, who assembled a search party and headed to the location the men described. The search for Travis Walton became one of the largest manhunts in Arizona history. Dozens of law enforcement officers, volunteers, and tracking dogs combed through the forest, looking for any sign of the missing man. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence of violence. Just a mysterious absence where Travis Walton should have been. Meanwhile, the 6 witnesses were separated and interrogated extensively. Their stories matched in all the essential details, and their emotional distress seemed genuine. But the sheriff remained skeptical. This was the era of UFO hysteria, he reasoned, and these men might be using that cultural climate to mask something more mundane and sinister. The crew members agreed to take polygraph tests. 5 of the 6 passed conclusively. The 6th test was ruled inconclusive, not because the examiner detected deception, but because the witness was so emotionally distraught that getting reliable readings was impossible. Still, the sheriff wasn't convinced. He considered the possibility that the men had killed Travis, hidden the body, and collectively agreed to this UFO story as a cover. He had the men followed, hoping they might lead investigators to wherever they'd hidden Travis's remains. But the surveillance revealed nothing unusual. Days passed with no sign of Travis Walton, dead or alive. His family was devastated, caught between hope and despair, not knowing if he'd been abducted, murdered, or was perhaps still alive somewhere. The media descended on Snowflake, turning the small Arizona town into the center of a national news story. UFO researchers flew in from around the country. Skeptics arrived to debunk what they were certain was a hoax. The circus atmosphere must have been surreal for the Walton family and for the 6 crew members, who found themselves suspected of murder while still processing their own traumatic experience of witnessing what they believed was their friend being killed by an alien spacecraft. Then, on November 10th, 5 days after his disappearance, Travis Walton suddenly reappeared. It was late evening when the phone rang at Travis's sister's house. The voice on the other end was Travis, though he sounded disoriented and distressed. He said he was at a gas station in Heber, about 30 miles from where he'd disappeared, and he needed help. He didn't know where he'd been or what day it was. As far as Travis was concerned, only a few hours had passed since the beam had struck him in the forest. Travis's family and Mike Rogers raced to Heber and found Travis in a phone booth at the gas station. He was exhausted, emotionally shaken, and several pounds lighter than he'd been 5 days earlier. His family took him to a nearby hospital, where doctors examined him, but found no serious physical injuries. There was some minor dehydration and evidence of stress, but nothing that would explain where he'd been or what had happened to him during the 5 days he was missing. Over the following days and weeks, Travis began to remember more about his experience, though some memories took years to fully surface. His account of what happened during those 5 days, particularly the time he spent conscious, is one of the most detailed and disturbing alien abduction narratives on record. Travis's first memory after being struck by the beam was of waking up on a table in a dimly lit room. The last thing he remembered clearly was being hit by that blue-green light and the pain and shock that had surged through his body. Now he was lying on his back, staring up at a curved ceiling, feeling disoriented and confused. His clothing was bunched up around his torso, his shirt pulled up and his pants pushed down, as if someone had been examining his midsection. He felt sore, weak, and deeply confused about where he was and how he'd gotten there. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Travis became aware of shapes moving around him. At first, he thought they might be doctors, that perhaps he was in a hospital after being injured in the forest. But as the shapes came into clearer focus, he realized with mounting horror that these weren't humans at all. They were small, approximately 5 feet tall or less, with large bulbous heads that seemed too big for their thin bodies. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were huge, dark, and liquid-looking, taking up much of their faces. They had small slits for noses, tiny mouths, and no visible ears. Their hands, as they reached toward him, had long, thin fingers that looked almost skeletal. Travis reacted with pure terror and instinctual aggression. He pushed one of the beings away and scrambled off the table, looking desperately for an exit, for any way out of this nightmare. The beings didn't try to stop him or pursue him. They simply backed away, seeming almost surprised or perhaps alarmed by his violent reaction. Travis stumbled toward a doorway he could see in the curved wall and escaped into what looked like a corridor, running away from the examination room and the strange beings, with no plan beyond getting as far away from them as possible. The corridor was curved, following the shape of what Travis now realized must be some kind of spacecraft. The walls emitted a soft glow, providing just enough light to see by. Travis tried several doors, finding most of them locked or sealed, but eventually he found one that opened. He entered another room, this one larger and dominated by what looked like a command center or control room. There was a chair in the center of the room, surrounded by panels with buttons and controls that meant nothing to Travis. In his desperation and confusion, he sat in the chair and began touching the controls, not knowing what he was doing but hoping he might accidentally trigger something that would help him escape. The panels responded to his touch, displaying images and what might have been star maps or navigational charts, though Travis couldn't make sense of any of it. He was still frantically pushing buttons when a figure appeared in the doorway. But this being was different from the small gray creatures that had been examining him. This one was taller, more human-looking, though still clearly not human. The being was about 6 feet tall, with a face that was more human-like in its proportions, though the features still seemed slightly off, too perfect or symmetrical in a way that triggered an uncanny valley response in Travis's mind. The being approached Travis with a calm, almost gentle demeanor and placed something over Travis's face, something like a mask, but softer, more flexible. Travis tried to resist, but he had no strength left, no energy to fight. He took a breath through the mask and felt consciousness slipping away, his vision darkening as whatever he'd inhaled pulled him back down into unconsciousness. His next memory was of waking up on the highway outside Heber, lying on the road surface, cold and disoriented. He watched as a craft, similar to the one that had been in the clearing, but perhaps not identical, rose into the sky above him and then shot away at incredible speed. Travis was alone on an empty stretch of highway in the middle of the night, with no idea how he'd gotten there or what day it was, feeling like he'd been gone only hours, but somehow knowing, on some level, that more time had passed than his memories could account for. The physical and psychological aftermath of Travis's experience was severe and long-lasting. In the immediate aftermath of his return, he was exhausted, confused, and emotionally traumatized. He lost weight during the 5 days he was missing, more weight than would be typical for someone going without food for that period, suggesting either prolonged stress or perhaps that his metabolism had been affected in some way by whatever had been done to him. He experienced nightmares and anxiety that would persist for years. Bright lights made him uncomfortable, triggering visceral reactions that seemed disproportionate until one considered what bright lights must have represented to him after his experience. Travis agreed to take a polygraph test, wanting to prove his story was true. The test was arranged by the National Enquirer, which had offered a $5,000 prize for the best UFO case of the year. Travis passed the polygraph, according to the examiner, but skeptics pointed out that polygraphs can be beaten, or that Travis might have genuinely believed his experience was real, even if it wasn't, making the polygraph results less definitive than they might otherwise be. In 1993, Travis took another polygraph test, this time administered by a different examiner using more modern equipment. He passed this test as well, with the examiner concluding that Travis was being truthful when he described his abduction experience. The case attracted immediate and sustained skepticism. Some pointed out that Travis had an interest in UFOs before his disappearance, that he'd talked about wanting to have a close encounter. Others noted that the logging crew was behind schedule on their Forest Service contract and would have faced financial penalties for not completing the work on time. The theory emerged that Travis had run away to avoid the hard work and financial consequences, while his co-workers, rather than face the financial ruin of defaulting on the contract, invented the UFO story to buy themselves time. The problem with this theory is that it requires not just Travis, but all 6 other men to maintain an elaborate lie for decades, despite having nothing to gain from it and much to lose in terms of ridicule and suspicion of being involved in Travis's disappearance. Philip J. Klass, the same skeptic who had attacked the Pascagoula case, went after the Walton case with particular vigor. He claimed to have evidence that Travis had failed early polygraph tests, though these claims were disputed by the actual polygraph examiners. Klass suggested that Travis might have hidden in the forest for 5 days, though this theory couldn't explain how Travis would have survived in the cold November weather without proper equipment, or why he would return so disoriented and underweight, or how he managed to arrive at a gas station 30 miles from where he disappeared with no means of transportation and no memory of traveling there. Travis's own brother, Dwayne Walton, initially had doubts about the UFO explanation. He wondered if Travis had hit his head when the beam knocked him down and wandered off in a dazed state, only to return days later with confused memories. But Travis had no head injury, no signs of having wandered in the wilderness for days, and his story remained consistent through decades of retellings. Dwayne eventually became one of Travis's strongest supporters, convinced that whatever skepticism he'd initially felt was outweighed by the evidence and his brother's unwavering insistence that the experience was real. In 1993, Travis's story was adapted into a movie called Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney as Travis. The film took significant liberties with Travis's account, particularly the scenes aboard the alien craft, which were made much more horrific and violent than what Travis described. While Travis appreciated that his story was being told to a wider audience, he was disappointed by the artistic changes that he felt sensationalized and distorted what had actually happened to him. The real experience had been traumatic enough without Hollywood embellishment, and he worried that the dramatized version would make it harder for people to take his actual account seriously. Travis has spent decades since his abduction speaking at UFO conferences, giving interviews and defending his story against skeptics. He's weathered ridicule, accusations of hoaxing, and even death threats from people who believe he's lying. Through it all, he's never wavered from his account of what happened in that Arizona forest and aboard that alien craft. He's never profited significantly from his experience. Any money he's made from speaking engagements and book sales, offset by the cost to his privacy, reputation, and peace of mind. For Travis Walton, the 5 days he spent missing in November of 1975 define the rest of his life, marking him as either one of the most credible alien abduction witnesses in history or one of the most successful hoaxers, depending on who's doing the judging. The year after Travis Walton's experience, another group of witnesses would report an encounter that shared some disturbing similarities with other abduction cases, but occurred in a setting that seemed almost designed to make the story harder to dismiss. In August of 1976, 4 friends went on a camping and fishing trip in the remote Allagash Wilderness Waterway in northern Maine, hoping for a week of outdoor recreation away from the demands of their art school studies. What they experienced would bind them together in ways they never anticipated, and would raise questions about the reliability of memory and the reality of alien encounters that remain unanswered to this day. Jack and Jim Weiner were twin brothers, both art students at the Massachusetts College of Art. Their friends Chuck Rack and Charlie Foltz were also art students, and the 4 had decided to take this camping trip together before another intense school year began. They hired a float plane to take them and their canoes to Eagle Lake, deep in the Maine wilderness, where they'd spend several days canoeing, fishing, and enjoying the solitude of one of the most remote regions in the eastern United States. The first few days of the trip were unremarkable, exactly what the 4 men had hoped for: clean air, quiet waters, good fishing, and the kind of peace that comes from being far from civilization. But on their second night at Eagle Lake, Jim noticed something odd. A bright light appeared in the sky, much brighter than any star, and it seemed to be moving. He pointed it out to the others, and they watched for perhaps 30 seconds before the light simply vanished, blinking out as if someone had thrown a switch. The men discussed what they'd seen, coming up with various mundane explanations: satellite, high-altitude plane, meteor, and thought little more about it. 2 nights later, on August 20th, the 4 friends decided to go night fishing on the lake. They built a large fire on shore before setting out in their canoe, intending to use the fire as a beacon to guide them back to their campsite in the pitch darkness of the Maine wilderness at night. Anyone who's been in a truly remote area at night understands how absolute that darkness can be. No ambient light from cities or towns, no street lights or house lights to orient yourself by, just the stars above and the darkness all around. As they paddled out onto the lake, Chuck Rack began to feel uneasy, sensing something wrong, though he couldn't articulate what. Then he saw the light. It was the same bright object they'd seen 2 nights before, or something very similar, and it was rising from the trees on the shoreline. Chuck shouted to the others, and they all turned to look at what appeared to be a large, oval-shaped object hovering above the forest. The object was glowing with its own light, colors rippling across its surface in a way that Chuck would later compare to watching hot sauce come to a boil, constant subtle movement and shifting that was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. The craft moved toward them, and the men reacted with fear, paddling frantically toward shore, toward their campsite and the safety of the fire they'd built. But before they could reach shore, a beam of light shot out from the object, enveloping their canoe. The light was blue-white and intensely bright, and as it hit them, the men felt themselves being lifted, canoe and all, pulled up out of the water toward the hovering craft, and then their memories simply stop. The next thing any of them could clearly remember was being back in their canoe, on the water, heading toward shore. The fire they'd built, which should have been blazing when they returned since they'd constructed it to burn for hours, was burned down to nothing but embers. Somehow, several hours had passed. Hours the men couldn't account for. Time that was simply missing from their lives with no memory of where they'd been or what they'd been doing. The men returned to shore, confused and unsettled. They didn't discuss what had just happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. The time they couldn't remember. It was as if each man was afraid to voice his concerns, worried that speaking about the missing time would make it real in a way that silence might prevent. They spent the remainder of their trip trying to act normal, to enjoy their vacation. But the unspoken awareness of those lost hours hung over them like a dark cloud. Back home, all four men tried to move on with their lives, to forget about that strange night on Eagle Lake. But forgetting proved impossible. Jim and Jack began having terrible nightmares, vivid and disturbing dreams that left them waking in cold sweats. In these dreams, they were aboard some kind of craft, surrounded by beings with large eyes that seemed to see into their very souls. They were being examined, touched by thin-fingered hands that felt both curious and clinical. The dreams were so consistent, so detailed, that they began to feel less like normal nightmares and more like suppressed memories trying to surface. Years passed, and the nightmares didn't stop. Finally, in 1988, more than a decade after the camping trip, Jim Weiner decided he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to understand what had happened that night, even if the truth turned out to be worse than the not knowing. He contacted Ray Fowler, a respected UFO researcher known for his careful, methodical investigations. Fowler agreed to look into the case and recommended that all four men undergo hypnotic regression to see if they could recover memories of the missing time. The four friends agreed, though not without trepidation. They each underwent separate hypnosis sessions, none knowing what the others had said under hypnosis, to prevent their accounts from being contaminated by each other's testimonies. What emerged during these sessions was remarkably consistent and deeply disturbing. Under hypnosis, all four men described being taken aboard the craft in their canoe. They remembered being unable to move, paralyzed by some force they couldn't see, but could feel holding them in place. They were floated up into the craft, which was much larger on the inside than its exterior dimensions should have allowed, with curved walls and strange lighting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Once inside, they were separated. Each man was taken to a different area of the craft and placed on what felt like an examination table or chair. The beings that performed the examinations were described consistently by all four witnesses: small, approximately 4 to 5 feet tall, with large heads, enormous dark eyes, thin bodies, and long fingers. The beings didn't speak, but seemed to communicate telepathically, projecting feelings of calmness and assurances that no harm was intended, though these mental messages did little to alleviate the terror each man felt. The examinations were thorough and invasive. The beings took samples of hair, skin, and other tissues. They ran instruments over the men's bodies, devices that glowed or hummed, but whose purposes the men couldn't understand. Some of the procedures were painful. One particularly disturbing element that multiple witnesses described was some kind of probe or device being inserted into their nasal cavities, a procedure that caused intense pain and left them feeling violated in ways that were difficult to articulate. The beings seemed particularly interested in the Weiner twins. Jack and Jim were subjected to longer examinations than Chuck or Charlie, and the beings appeared to be taking special notice of them, perhaps collecting extra samples or data. Jack recalled being told telepathically that he shouldn't be afraid, that what was happening was important and wouldn't cause permanent harm. But knowing that intellectually did nothing to make the experience less traumatizing emotionally. Charlie described the interior of the craft as looking almost clinical, like a doctor's office, but made of materials and with equipment he'd never seen before. Chuck recalled feeling a strange calm during part of the experience, as if something was being done to suppress his fear response, though underneath that artificially induced calm, he was aware of feeling absolutely terrified. Jim remembered the being's eyes most vividly, how they seemed endless and alien, looking at him with an intelligence that was definitely present but completely incomprehensible, as if the gulf between human and alien minds was so vast that true communication was impossible. After the examinations were complete, the men were returned to their canoe, which was gently placed back on the water. Their memories were suppressed or blocked somehow, leaving them with only that gap of missing time and a vague unease that something significant had happened. The men paddled to shore, discovered their fire had burned down, and went about the remainder of their trip in a state of confused denial about what might have occurred. The consistency of the accounts recovered under hypnosis was remarkable, especially given that the men were hypnotized separately over a period of months and had no opportunity to compare notes between sessions. But the use of hypnotic regression also provided ammunition for skeptics, who argued that hypnosis is notoriously unreliable and can create false memories as easily as it recovers real ones. The men might have been influenced by UFO stories they'd heard or read, by the expectations of the hypnotherapist, or by their own fears and imagination. Adding to the skepticism, in 2016, Chuck Rack publicly stated that he no longer believed the abduction part of the story was real. He maintained that the men had seen strange lights and had experienced something unusual. But he now believed the memories recovered under hypnosis were false, created by the hypnotic process itself, rather than being accurate recollections of real events. He also revealed, contradicting what he'd said during the initial investigation, that the group had been using recreational drugs on the night of the encounter, specifically hashish, which could potentially explain strange experiences or missing time. The other three men, Jack and Jim Weiner and Charlie Foltz, rejected Chuck's recantation. They pointed out that Chuck had been the least affected by the nightmares and recovered the least detailed memories under hypnosis. They suggested that he'd never fully processed what happened and was now trying to dismiss it rather than deal with the psychological burden of accepting it as real. They maintained that the abduction had occurred, that their memories recovered under hypnosis were genuine, and that Chuck's reversal was motivated by his own inability to cope with the truth rather than by any actual evidence that the abduction hadn't happened. The truth about what occurred that night at Eagle Lake remains contested. The case demonstrates the fundamental problem with many alien abduction accounts. Without physical evidence or independent witnesses, we're left with only the testimony of the experiencers, and human memory is fallible, especially when influenced by trauma, time, drugs, and suggestive therapeutic techniques like hypnosis. The Allagash case has elements that make it more compelling than many others. Multiple witnesses, consistent accounts, no obvious motive for hoaxing, but it also has elements that raise serious doubts. The late recovery of memories through hypnosis, the admission of drug use, the recantation by one witness. What cannot be doubted is that something happened to these four men that affected them deeply. Whether it was an alien abduction, a shared hallucination, a misinterpreted natural phenomenon combined with false memory creation, or something else entirely, the experience left psychological scars that have persisted for decades. The case remains a subject of debate among UFO researchers and serves as a reminder of how complex and ambiguous the evidence for alien abduction can be, even in cases that initially seem clear-cut. As the 1980s progressed, alien abduction reports continued to accumulate, but most remained relegated to specialized UFO publications and conferences, known mainly to enthusiasts and researchers rather than the general public. That changed dramatically in 1987 with the publication of a book that would bring the abduction phenomenon into mainstream consciousness in a way no previous case had managed to do. The book was called Communion, and its author, Whitley Strieber, was already a successful horror novelist whose previous works included The Walton and The Hunger. His status as an established writer, someone with a reputation and career to protect, lent his abduction claims a credibility that reports from ordinary citizens often lacked. Strieber's account began on the night of December 26, 1985, at his remote cabin in upstate New York. He was there with his wife and son, enjoying the aftermath of Christmas in the peaceful isolation of the woods. Strieber went to bed that night expecting nothing more unusual than a good night's sleep after the holiday festivities. Instead, he would experience something that would change his life irrevocably and eventually lead him to question everything he thought he knew about reality. His first clear memory after falling asleep was of being awake and aware that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't move, couldn't call out, couldn't do anything but watch as figures entered his bedroom. These beings were small, approximately 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and they moved with disturbing confidence, as if they had every right to be there, as if Strieber's cabin and his very body were theirs to access at will. The most prominent figure, and the one that would eventually grace the cover of Communion and become one of the most iconic images in UFO culture, had an enormous head with huge, dark, almond-shaped eyes that dominated its face. The being's skin appeared grayish or beige, and its mouth and nose were minimal, almost vestigial. Its body was thin and fragile-looking, but it moved with purpose and seemed to radiate an alien intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Strieber was floated out of his bedroom, through the house, and outside into the cold December night. He was taken to what he described as a tent-like structure in the woods near his cabin. The memories from this point became confused and traumatic. He recalled being examined, touched by thin fingers that explored his body with clinical detachment. He described procedures being performed on him, instruments inserted into various orifices, samples taken. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the physical procedures themselves, but the complete helplessness, the inability to resist or even protest what was being done to him. But unlike most abduction accounts, Strieber's experience didn't end with a simple examination and return. His encounters continued throughout the following months and years. He began to recall that these beings had been visiting him throughout his life, that what happened in December of 1985 wasn't his first encounter, but merely the first one he consciously remembered. These recovered memories were fragmentary and disturbing, childhood experiences that he'd blocked out or forgotten, moments throughout his adult life when he'd lost time or woken with inexplicable marks on his body, all now taking on new significance in light of what he was beginning to understand about his relationship with these visitors. Strieber sought out Dr. Donald Klein, a psychiatrist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, hoping to understand what was happening to him. He underwent extensive psychological testing, brain scans, and examinations to rule out mental illness, brain tumors, or other medical explanations for his experiences. The tests came back normal. Strieber was not suffering from schizophrenia, he didn't have a brain tumor, and his psychological profile was within normal ranges for someone who had experienced significant trauma but was not mentally ill in any clinical sense. Dr. Klein couldn't explain Strieber's experiences, but he could confirm that Strieber genuinely believed them to be real, and that he was exhibiting symptoms consistent with having undergone real trauma rather than imagined experiences. Under hypnosis conducted by Bud Hopkins, a prominent abduction researcher and artist, Strieber recovered more detailed memories of his encounters. The beings had not only examined him physically, but had engaged with him in what felt almost like psychological experiments or tests. They showed him images, some beautiful and others horrifying. They seemed interested in his reactions to various stimuli, as if studying human emotion and response. In some encounters, they removed something from his body or implanted something new, though medical examinations never found conclusive physical evidence of these alleged procedures. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Strieber's recovered memories was the suggestion that these beings had been manipulating his life for years, perhaps since childhood. He recalled being taken as a young boy and being told that he was special, that he had been chosen for something important. As he worked to recover more memories, he began to wonder if even his successful career as a writer might have been influenced by his experiences with the visitors. His horror novels, with their themes of predators hidden among humans and the thin line between reality and nightmare, took on new significance. Had his subconscious mind been processing these traumatic encounters and turning them into fiction as a coping mechanism? When Communion was published in early 1987, it became an immediate bestseller, remaining on the New York Times bestseller list for months. The book's cover, featuring a painting of one of the gray aliens with its enormous eyes staring directly at the viewer, became an iconic image, instantly recognizable even to people who'd never read the book or had any interest in UFOs. Strieber appeared on television shows, gave countless interviews, and found himself at the center of a phenomenon he'd never sought, and wasn't entirely sure how to manage. The response was polarized. Believers in alien abduction embraced Strieber's account as validation, proof that these experiences were real and happened to credible, successful people, not just to unreliable witnesses seeking attention. Letters poured in from readers who said they'd had similar experiences but had never spoken about them, afraid of ridicule or of being thought insane. Strieber's bravery in coming forward gave thousands of others permission to acknowledge their own experiences and seek support from researchers and support groups. But skeptics attacked the book and its author with equal fervor. They pointed out that Strieber was a fiction writer, someone who made his living creating believable fantasy. They suggested that Communion was simply his most successful work of fiction to date, marketed as non-fiction to increase sales and impact. They noted that many of the details in Strieber's account matched elements from previous UFO reports and popular culture, suggesting he'd either consciously or unconsciously absorbed these details and incorporated them into his own constructed narrative. Some critics went further, suggesting that Strieber might be suffering from sleep paralysis, a well-documented phenomenon where people wake up unable to move and often experience vivid hallucinations of figures in their room. Sleep paralysis can feel absolutely real while it's happening and can leave people convinced they've experienced something genuine rather than a neurological event. The alien features Strieber described, the large eyes and small body, match descriptions from various cultural traditions of supernatural entities that visit people at night, suggesting perhaps a common neurological or psychological basis for these experiences, rather than evidence of actual alien visitors. Strieber himself remained ambiguous about the nature of his experiences. Unlike many abductees who insisted their encounters were literally real extraterrestrial abductions, Strieber maintained that he didn't know what the visitors were or where they came from. He called them visitors rather than aliens, specifically to avoid making assumptions about their origin or nature. They might be extraterrestrial, he suggested, or they might be interdimensional beings, time travelers, aspects of human consciousness, or something else entirely beyond current human understanding. He was more interested in exploring the experiential reality of the encounters, what they felt like, and how they affected people, than in proving any particular explanation for what was causing them. In the years following Communion, Strieber wrote several more books about his experiences and the broader phenomenon of alien contact. He continued to report ongoing encounters and developed a complex philosophy about the nature of the visitors and their possible relationship to human consciousness and spiritual evolution. His later work moved away from pure abduction narrative and into more speculative territory, exploring ideas about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the possibility that these encounters might be part of some larger cosmic process of transformation for humanity. The legacy of Communion extends far beyond just another abduction account. The book brought alien abduction into the mainstream in a way no previous case had managed. The distinctive gray alien face on its cover became the default image of what aliens look like in popular culture, influencing movies, television shows, and countless works of fiction. Strieber's status as a successful author lent the abduction phenomenon a respectability it had previously lacked, making it acceptable for academics and mainstream media to discuss these cases seriously rather than dismissing them as fringe beliefs of credulous people. Whether Strieber's experiences were literally real, psychologically real, or some combination of both, their impact on UFO culture and on how we think about possible alien contact is undeniable. Communion stands as one of the most influential works in the entire UFO genre, a book that shaped not just how people report their experiences, but how they understand and interpret them. For better or worse, Whitley Strieber's visitors, with their enormous eyes and unsettling presence, became the face of alien contact for an entire generation. While Strieber was writing about his encounters in upstate New York, another case was developing that would push the boundaries of what people were willing to accept about alien abduction. This case involved not just a single witness or a small group, but potentially dozens of people, including, according to some accounts, a high-ranking political figure whose identity would remain officially unconfirmed, but whose alleged involvement would give the case an unprecedented level of significance and controversy. On the early morning of November 30th, 1989, Linda Napolitano, who would become known in UFO literature by the pseudonym Linda Corteil, was sleeping in her 12th floor apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. She lived there with her husband and 2 children, an ordinary middle-class family in one of the world's most densely populated urban areas. Around 3 in the morning, Linda would later claim, she was awakened by a presence in her bedroom. She found herself paralyzed, unable to move or cry out, as small gray beings materialized around her bed. What happened next, according to Linda and the investigators who would later study her case, was extraordinary not for what occurred to her, which followed the typical pattern of many abduction accounts, but for where it occurred and who allegedly witnessed it. Linda reported being floated out of her closed bedroom window, rising up the side of her apartment building while suspended in a bright blue beam of light. 3 of the gray beings accompanied her, floating alongside as she was pulled upward toward a large, reddish-orange UFO hovering above the building. As she approached the craft, she was pulled inside, the beam depositing her in what she would describe as an examination room. The abduction itself followed familiar patterns. Linda was examined by the beings. Procedures were performed that she couldn't fully understand. Samples appeared to be taken from her body. She felt violated and terrified, but also strangely calm at times, as if her emotional responses were being dampened or controlled by the beings. After what felt like hours, but might have been less time than that, she was returned to her apartment, deposited back in her bed, with the beings and the craft vanishing as mysteriously as they'd appeared. When Linda woke the next morning, she initially thought it had been a nightmare, albeit a vivid and disturbing one. She'd had some previous experiences that she'd interpreted as possible alien encounters, and she'd been in contact with Bud Hopkins, the prominent abduction researcher who had hypnotized Whitley Strieber. But this experience felt different, more intense and more real than previous ones. She reported it to Hopkins, who began investigating, initially treating it as one of many similar cases he was studying. But then the letters started arriving. The first came from 2 men who identified themselves only as Richard and Dan, claiming to be security personnel who had been in a car that stalled beneath the FDR drive at around 3 in the morning on November 30th. From their position in the stalled vehicle, they wrote, they had watched in stunned disbelief as a woman was floated out of an apartment window 12 stories up, accompanied by 3 small beings, all suspended in a beam of blue-white light. They described the woman and the beings being pulled up into a large craft that then flew off over the Brooklyn Bridge. The men's description of the woman matched Linda. The location they gave matched her apartment building, and the time they specified matched when she believed her abduction had occurred. According to Hopkins's investigation and his book about the case, which he titled Witnessed the True Story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO Abduction, Richard and Dan claimed to have been part of a security detail for an important international political figure who had also witnessed the abduction from the stalled car. This unnamed official was described in Hopkins's account as being highly placed in the United Nations, leading to speculation that he might have been Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar, though this was never confirmed and de Cuellar never publicly commented on the case. The addition of independent witnesses, particularly witnesses of such alleged importance and credibility, transformed Linda's case from one of thousands of similar abduction accounts into something unprecedented. Here was an abduction that had supposedly occurred in plain view in one of the busiest cities in the world, witnessed not just by the experiencer, but by multiple other people, including individuals whose testimony would carry significant weight if they ever chose to come forward publicly. But there were problems with the case. Significant problems that have made it one of the most controversial in all of UFO research. The witnesses, Richard and Dan, never came forward publicly. They never gave their real names. They never appeared for interviews or provided any evidence beyond their letters to Hopkins that they actually existed. The high-ranking UN official, if he existed, never acknowledged being involved in any way. Without these witnesses coming forward to be interviewed, to have their accounts tested and their identities verified, the case rested almost entirely on Hopkins's investigation and Linda's testimony. Additional witnesses did allegedly come forward, people who claimed to have seen a UFO over the East River that night, or to have witnessed something unusual involving a craft and a beam of light. Hopkins documented these claims, arguing that they provided corroboration for Linda's experience, but skeptics pointed out that these additional witnesses were also anonymous, that their accounts came to Hopkins through Linda or through other researchers, and that there was no way to verify they were genuine independent witnesses rather than people influenced by the publicity around the case, or even potentially invented to strengthen Linda's claims. The case became even more bizarre as it continued. According to Hopkins's account, Richard and Dan became increasingly unstable as they processed what they'd witnessed. One of them allegedly developed a disturbing obsession with Linda, believing that their connection went back to childhood abductions they'd both experienced. The other allegedly became paranoid and violent. The complexity and strangeness of these developments led some researchers to question whether Hopkins, who was known to be credulous about abduction accounts, was being manipulated by Linda, or whether the entire case might be an elaborate fabrication. Linda herself has remained consistent in her claims. She maintains that everything happened exactly as she described, that she was abducted from her apartment in full view of multiple witnesses, that the case is as significant as Hopkins believed it to be. She's faced decades of skepticism and mockery, had her credibility attacked, been accused of being either a knowing hoaxer or a deluded fantasist. Through it all, she's insisted on the literal truth of her experience and expressed frustration that the witnesses who could vindicate her have never come forward publicly to do so. The Brooklyn Bridge case, as it came to be known, represents both the potential and the problems of abduction research. If Linda's account is true, if there really were multiple credible witnesses, including highly placed officials, then this case would be among the most important in all of UFO history, providing the kind of multiple witness corroboration that could make alien abduction impossible to dismiss. But if the case is false, whether through deliberate hoaxing or through more complex psychological processes, then it demonstrates how easily even experienced researchers can be led astray, how the desire to find that perfect case can blind investigators to red flags and inconsistencies that should raise doubts. In recent years, the case has been revisited by skeptics and believers alike. A Netflix documentary series examined Linda's claims and included commentary from Carol Rainey, who was married to Bud Hopkins for a time and had access to his research files. Rainey, who initially believed Linda's account, came to conclude that there were serious problems with the case and that Hopkins might have been deceived. Linda sued Netflix over the documentary, claiming it defamed her and misrepresented her experiences. The lawsuit brought new attention to a case that had largely faded from public awareness, though it did little to resolve the fundamental questions about what, if anything, really happened that November night in Manhattan. The cases we've explored so far represent some of the most famous and well-documented alien abduction reports in history. But they're far from the only ones. Thousands of people have reported similar experiences, encounters that share common elements despite occurring across different times and places to people with no apparent connection to each other. This consistency is cited by believers as evidence that something real is happening, that there's a genuine phenomenon underlying these reports. Skeptics counter that the consistency simply shows cultural contamination, with later reports being influenced by earlier ones that have become part of our collective UFO mythology. Let's briefly explore several additional cases that, while perhaps less famous than those already discussed, are no less disturbing and remarkable in their own ways. Each adds its own unique elements to the broader pattern of alien abduction reports, and together they help illustrate both the commonalities and the variations in these extraordinary claims. One case that stands out for both its early timing and its lifetime of repeated encounters is that of Jesse Long, whose experiences began when he was just a child and continued throughout his adult life, creating a pattern that would become increasingly common in later abduction reports, but was highly unusual when his encounters began in the late 1950s. In 1957, 5-year-old Jesse Long was playing with his brother John behind their home in Rogersville, Tennessee, when they discovered what appeared to be a round house under construction on a hilltop. The structure was unusual, dome-shaped and metallic, but the boys were curious rather than frightened as they approached to investigate. As they got closer, they saw a tall figure standing near the structure, holding what looked like a long rod or wand. The figure pointed the rod at the boys, and a beam of light shot out, hitting Jesse directly. He felt himself becoming paralyzed, unable to move or call out, and then his conscious memory simply stopped. Jesse had no recollection of what happened next until decades later, when he underwent hypnotic regression in January of 1991. The sessions revealed traumatic memories that had been suppressed for over 30 years. Under hypnosis, Jesse recalled being taken inside the craft, separated from his brother, and placed in an examination room. The beings that examined him were small, with large heads and enormous eyes, and they communicated with him telepathically rather than through spoken language. They performed procedures on his legs, and Jesse recalled pain, fear, and a desperate desire to escape that was thwarted by his inability to move. What made Jesse's case particularly significant was physical evidence that seemed to corroborate his account. For 34 years, Jesse experienced pain in his left shin, a constant ache at a specific spot that he couldn't explain. He would pull his socks down below this point to avoid the discomfort of fabric touching the area. In 1991, he finally underwent surgery to investigate what might be causing the pain. Doctors removed a small object from his leg, something that had been embedded deep in the tissue for decades. The object was sent to the Southwest Research Institute in Texas for analysis. The laboratory report described the object as having a remarkable composition with unique surface characteristics that couldn't be easily explained. It appeared to be made of a glassy material that exhibited properties unlike typical terrestrial substances. While skeptics suggested it might simply be a shard of glass that had somehow become embedded in Jesse's leg as a child, this explanation struggled to account for the object's unusual composition and the fact that it had been in his leg since precisely the time of his first remembered encounter. But Jesse's experiences didn't end with that first childhood abduction. Throughout his life, he reported multiple repeat encounters, and as he grew older, these experiences became more frightening and more invasive. Most followed a similar pattern. Jesse would be taken aboard a craft, led down a corridor into an examination room, and placed on a table where he would be physically restrained so he couldn't resist. The beings would perform various procedures, but the most traumatic and psychologically damaging involved the extraction of his semen, a procedure that left Jesse feeling violated and humiliated in ways that caused lasting psychological damage. During one abduction in 1990, Jesse was driving from California to New Orleans when his car was lifted off Interstate 40 near Albuquerque, New Mexico. Car and driver were brought inside a craft together, and once inside, Jesse was shown something that provided what seemed to be an answer to the question that had haunted him all his life. Why was this happening to him? The beings presented him with a baby, communicating that this was his child, created using the genetic material they had taken from him during previous abductions. Then they showed him 9 other children, all standing against a wall, all looking at him with eyes that reflected both human and alien characteristics. Jesse knew immediately, with a certainty that transcended logic, that these were all his children, human-alien hybrids created through some breeding program he'd been unwittingly participating in throughout his life. Each child walked up to Jesse and touched his hand, looking directly into his eyes. The experience was overwhelming and emotional. The children seemed to be communicating without words that they were okay, that Jesse shouldn't worry about them. But the comfort these silent assurances might have provided was overwhelmed by the horror of the situation. Jesse had been used as breeding stock, his genetic material harvested without consent to create children he would never raise, never know, children who existed in some realm beyond his reach or understanding. The psychological impact of Jesse's experiences was severe and lasting. He was diagnosed with body dysmorphic disorder, a condition where an individual becomes excessively concerned about perceived physical defects. For Jesse, this seemed to stem from the repeated violations of his body during the abductions, the sense that his physical form had been used and altered by these beings for purposes he couldn't control or fully understand. He struggled with depression, anxiety, and the fundamental question that plagued so many abductees: why me? When asked what he would say if he could confront his abductors, Jesse's response was simple and heartbreaking. He would ask them why they chose him and what reason they had for subjecting him to these experiences. He wanted to understand, to find some meaning in the trauma he'd endured since childhood. But like so many abductees, he was left with questions that had no answers, with memories that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality, and with the burden of experiences that most people would dismiss as impossible or insane. Dr. David Jacobs, a professor of history at Temple University who specialized in studying abduction phenomena, investigated Jesse's case and concluded that it fit into a broader pattern he'd identified across thousands of similar reports. Jacobs theorized that a systematic program was being conducted, a form of physiological exploitation by one species of another, a breeding initiative aimed at creating hybrid offspring for purposes that remained unclear but seemed to involve some kind of colonization program. Whether Jacobs's interpretation is correct or not, Jesse Long's case represents one of the most detailed and well-documented examples of alleged lifelong abduction experiences, complete with physical evidence, psychological trauma, and a narrative consistency that's difficult to dismiss out of hand. Moving to a different setting and a different type of encounter, the summer of 1968 brought an extraordinary incident at a girls' summer camp in Vermont that would go unreported for a decade before one of the witnesses, haunted by nightmares, would finally seek help in understanding what had happened to him on the shores of Lake Champlain. Buff Ledge Camp, located just north of Burlington, Vermont, was a popular summer destination for young women in the 1960s. The camp offered a range of activities on the picturesque shores of Lake Champlain, and on August 7, 1968, most of the campers and many staff members were away at a swimming competition in Burlington, leaving the facility nearly deserted. 2 employees who had remained behind, 16-year-old maintenance worker Michael Lapp and 19-year-old water ski instructor Janet Cornell, were relaxing on a boat dock in the late afternoon, watching the sun set over the water and enjoying the rare peace and quiet of an empty camp. As darkness began to fall and the first stars appeared in the sky, Michael noticed what he initially thought was Venus, or perhaps a particularly bright star. But as he watched, the light began to behave in ways that stars simply don't behave. It was moving, and not in the slow, predictable arc of a satellite or plane. Instead, it seemed to be descending, getting brighter and closer, until Michael realized this wasn't a celestial object at all, but something much more immediate and inexplicable. The light resolved itself into multiple objects, 3 spherical craft that moved with impossible agility, darting and weaving through the air in patterns that defied conventional aerodynamics. The objects performed maneuvers that seemed almost playful, like children playing tag in the sky, banking sharply and accelerating instantly from a standstill to incredible speeds. Michael and Janet watched, transfixed, as the 3 objects performed their aerial ballet over the lake. Then suddenly, 2 of the craft shot upward and vanished, leaving only 1 remaining. The single remaining craft passed directly over Michael and Janet, then suddenly tilted and dove straight down into Lake Champlain. For several minutes, there was nothing, just the quiet lake and the gathering darkness. Then the object emerged from the water, completely dry and seemingly unaffected by its submersion, and began gliding directly toward the boat dock where Michael and Janet sat watching. As the craft approached, Michael could see through what appeared to be a transparent dome on its upper surface. Inside, 2 figures were visible, and they weren't human. The beings had elongated necks, disproportionately large heads, and no visible hair. Their eyes were enormous, wrapping around the sides of their heads in a way that suggested a much wider field of vision than human eyes could provide. The beings seemed to be aware of Michael and Janet, watching them with what might have been curiosity or scientific interest. In a moment that would seem almost comical if it weren't so terrifying, Michael, perhaps acting on instinct or nervousness, slapped his knee. To his shock, one of the beings inside the craft mimicked the gesture, slapping what might have been its equivalent of a knee. The beings seemed to be attempting some kind of communication, or perhaps demonstrating their awareness of Michael's actions. But whatever message they were trying to convey, it was about to become much more direct and much more frightening. The craft moved directly overhead, positioning itself perhaps 50 feet above the dock, and then it shot a beam of light down at Michael and Janet. Michael, acting on pure survival instinct, grabbed Janet's shoulder and pulled both of them down onto their backs on the wooden dock. He remembered screaming, "We don't want to go," and feeling absolute terror at the thought of being taken by these beings. And then his memory simply stopped, as if someone had pressed a delete button on his consciousness. The next clear memory Michael had was of sitting on the dock, staring at the craft, which was now much farther away. Janet was beside him, sitting in what seemed like a trance, unresponsive to his attempts to get her attention. It was completely dark now, much darker than it should have been given how recently the sun had set. Time had passed, a significant amount of time, but Michael had no memory of where those hours had gone. Soon they heard voices, the swim team returning from Burlington, talking and laughing as they made their way back to the camp facilities. The UFO, as if aware that its window of privacy was closing, moved higher into the sky, flashed its lights several times in what might have been a farewell or a warning, and then vanished completely. Michael turned to Janet, questions forming on his lips, but before he could speak, she seemed to snap out of her trance. They looked at each other, both aware that something profound had happened, but both also somehow reluctant or unable to discuss it. They agreed, without explicitly deciding, to say nothing about what they'd experienced, and for the rest of the summer, they maintained that silence. When the camp season ended, Michael and Janet went their separate ways, back to their individual lives and futures. For several years, Michael rarely thought about that night on the dock. He'd filed it away in some mental compartment labeled unexplained but not pressing, and life went on. But in time, the nightmares began. They started gradually, vague feelings of being trapped or chased, but they grew more intense and more specific. Michael began having recurring dreams of being abducted, of being taken against his will and subjected to examinations. The dreams were vivid and terrifying, and they always had the same desperate emotional core. I don't want to go. For 10 years, Michael lived with these nightmares, never connecting them consciously to that night at Buff Ledge, or perhaps not wanting to make that connection for fear of what it might mean. But finally, in 1978, he could no longer bear the psychological burden. He contacted the Center for UFO Studies, hoping they might have some insight into what was causing his nightmares, and whether they might be connected to the strange sighting he'd witnessed a decade earlier. The case was assigned to Walter Webb, a veteran UFO investigator and former lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. Webb was known for his methodical, scientific approach to investigating UFO claims, and he brought that same rigor to Michael's case. After hearing Michael's account of the sighting and the nightmares, Webb suggested hypnotic regression as a tool to explore what might have happened during that missing time, to unlock memories that might be buried beneath layers of psychological protection. Under hypnosis, Michael's memories came flooding back with startling clarity. He remembered the beam of light hitting him and Janet, remembered feeling himself being lifted off the dock, as if gravity had simply ceased to apply to his body. He was floated up into the craft, which was much larger on the inside than its exterior suggested. The interior was metallic and curved, with a soft glow emanating from the walls themselves rather than from distinct light fixtures. He was taken down a corridor into an examination room, and there, to his horror, he saw Janet lying on a table, apparently unconscious or paralyzed, being examined by the beings. Michael was placed on his own examination table, restrained by some invisible force that held him immobile, despite his desperate attempts to move. The beings moved around him with clinical efficiency, running instruments over his body, touching him with their thin fingers, communicating among themselves in ways Michael couldn't hear or understand. The experience was terrifying, not just because of the physical procedures, but because of the complete helplessness, the awareness that he was utterly at the mercy of beings whose motivations and nature he couldn't begin to comprehend. Webb then arranged for Janet to undergo hypnotic regression as well, conducting her session separately from Michael's to ensure their accounts wouldn't be contaminated by each other's testimonies. Janet's recovered memories matched Michael's in all essential details. She described the cold metal of the examination table, the feeling of something pulling her hair and pinching her neck, the beings moving around her, taking samples, running instruments over her body. Her account corroborated Michael's, suggesting that both had experienced something real that night, something that left them with genuine traumatic memories, even if those memories had been suppressed for a decade. But Webb didn't stop with just Michael and Janet's accounts. He conducted extensive research with former staff members and campers from Buff Ledge, and what he discovered lent additional credibility to the case. Multiple former employees reported having seen strange lights over Lake Champlain on the same night as Michael and Janet's encounter. The descriptions matched: bright objects moving in impossible patterns, performing maneuvers no conventional aircraft could execute. 2 other employees even reported having had experiences earlier that summer that sounded suspiciously like abduction encounters, though they'd been even more reluctant to discuss them than Michael and Janet had been. Webb's investigation of the Buff Ledge case would stretch over 5 years and become one of the most thorough and well-documented studies of an alleged alien abduction ever conducted. His final report spanned hundreds of pages and included not just the hypnotic regression transcripts, but also psychological evaluations of the witnesses, interviews with corroborating witnesses, analysis of the location and timeline, and careful consideration of potential conventional explanations for the events. Webb's conclusion was cautious but clear. Something extraordinary had happened to Michael Lapp and Janet Cornell on that August evening in 1968, something that defied conventional explanation and that left both witnesses with genuine psychological trauma consistent with having undergone a real, terrifying experience rather than having imagined one. The Buff Ledge case remains one of the most credible multiple witness abduction accounts on record, distinguished by its delayed reporting, reducing the likelihood that the witnesses coordinated their stories for attention or profit, by the methodical investigation it received, by the corroborating witness testimony about unusual phenomena that night, and by the psychological profiles of the witnesses, both of whom were evaluated as credible individuals with no history of attention-seeking behavior or mental illness. Whether the experience represents genuine extraterrestrial contact, some kind of undiscovered natural phenomenon that can create false memories of abduction, or something else entirely beyond our current understanding, the case stands as a reminder that there are experiences reported by ordinary people that challenge our conventional understanding of what's possible. In 1987, the same year Communion was published, a woman named Debbie Jordan, who would later reveal her identity after being featured anonymously in Bud Hopkins's book Intruders, reported a series of abductions that included elements rarely seen in other cases. Debbie claimed that during her encounters, the beings had shown her what appeared to be hybrid children, part human and part alien, which they indicated were in some way related to her. The beings seemed to want her to bond with these hybrid children, holding them and interacting with them in ways that felt both maternal and deeply wrong. Debbie described the hybrid children as having features that were a blend of human and alien characteristics, recognizably childlike, but with oversized heads and eyes that marked them as other. This element of hybrid children and breeding programs would become increasingly common in abduction reports following Hopkins's research. Critics argued this was evidence of cultural contamination, with abductees incorporating elements from Hopkins's publicized cases into their own accounts. But Hopkins and other researchers countered that they'd been hearing about hybrid children long before publishing about them, and that experiencers were initially reluctant to report this aspect of their encounters because it seemed too bizarre and would invite even more skepticism than the abduction claims already faced. Further back in history, in 1967, a police officer named Herbert Schirmer reported an encounter in Ashland, Nebraska that shared elements with many later abduction accounts, despite occurring before the Hill case had become widely publicized. Schirmer was on patrol when he encountered a strange craft on the highway. He remembered approaching it and then found himself driving away with no memory of what had occurred between these two events. Under hypnosis, Schirmer recalled being taken aboard the craft by humanoid beings who communicated with him about their purposes and origins. The beings allegedly told him they were from Venus, though this claim was met with particular skepticism given that Venus's hostile environment makes it an unlikely home for life as we know it. What made Schirmer's case notable was that he was a law enforcement officer, someone trained in observation and with a reputation to protect. He had no reason to invent such a story and much to lose by reporting it. Yet he maintained his account was real, even as it effectively ended his career in law enforcement, with the ridicule and suspicion that followed his report making it impossible for him to continue working as a police officer. In 1976, the same year as the Allagash incident, a woman in Liberty, Kentucky, reported a disturbing encounter with what she described as humanoid beings that invaded her home. Louise Smith, along with two friends, had been driving home from dinner when they encountered a large, bright object in the sky. They stopped to look at it, and the next thing they clearly remembered was being much further down the road than they should have been, with over an hour of missing time. Under hypnosis, the women described being taken to some kind of facility where they were examined. Louise recalled being forced onto a table and having a device or probe inserted into her body despite her protests and struggles. The experience left her with nightmares and psychological trauma that persisted for years. What distinguished this case was the physical evidence that seemed to corroborate the women's account. Their car showed strange marks and damage that hadn't been there before the encounter. Louise developed a painful red mark on her neck that lasted for weeks, and all three women exhibited symptoms of trauma and distress that their psychologist confirmed were consistent with having undergone a genuinely frightening experience rather than having imagined or invented one. Moving forward to the 1990s, Peter Khoury, an Australian resident originally from Lebanon, reported an encounter in 1992 that became notable for including what might be physical evidence of alien contact. Khoury claimed he was visited in his home by two female beings, one Asian in appearance and one with Nordic features and white blonde hair. He described a sexual encounter with one of the beings, similar to aspects of the Antonio Villas Boas case, and crucially, he claimed to have recovered strands of blonde hair from the encounter. These hair samples were analyzed by a genetics laboratory, and the results were puzzling. The hair showed unusual characteristics, including a rare genetic profile and some features that the lab couldn't easily explain using conventional analysis. While skeptics argued that the results could be explained by contamination or unusual but still human genetic variations, believers pointed to the analysis as potential physical proof of alien contact. The case remains controversial, with the hair samples still existing and available for further analysis, though no consensus has emerged about what they actually represent. In 1985, the same year Whitley Strieber's first remembered conscious encounter, a woman named Kelly Cahill in Australia reported an abduction that was remarkable for including multiple independent witnesses. Kelly and her husband were driving home from a friend's house when they encountered a large craft hovering over the road. They weren't alone. Another car with several occupants also stopped to watch the craft. Both groups of witnesses reported seeing beings emerge from the craft, tall and black with glowing red eyes, moving toward them with apparent hostile intent. Both groups, who didn't know each other and had been traveling in separate vehicles, lost time and later recovered memories of being taken aboard the craft. Medical examinations afterward revealed that Kelly had developed a strange triangular mark on her abdomen, and other witnesses reported similar marks and physical symptoms. The fact that multiple groups of witnesses who didn't know each other reported consistent details about the encounter lent the case unusual credibility, though skeptics suggested the witnesses might have discussed their experiences before reporting them, contaminating each other's accounts. These cases, and many others like them, form a tapestry of reports that stretches across decades and continents. Each case has its own unique details, but they share common elements: the paralysis or inability to resist, the medical examinations, the beings with large eyes and advanced technology, the missing time and recovered memories, the psychological trauma that persists long after the physical encounter has ended. Whether these commonalities represent a real phenomenon, cultural expectations shaping how people interpret ambiguous experiences, or some other explanation entirely, remains one of the most contentious debates in the study of unexplained phenomena. As we've journeyed through these accounts of alleged alien abduction, from the pioneering case of Betty and Barney Hill to the complexities of modern reports, certain patterns become clear. These experiences, whatever their ultimate explanation, have profound and lasting effects on those who report them. The terror of the initial encounter, the confusion and self-doubt that follow, the struggle to reconcile impossible memories with what we think we know about reality. All of these elements appear repeatedly across accounts from people who have nothing in common except their claim to have been taken by beings from elsewhere. The abduction phenomenon raises questions that go far beyond just whether aliens are visiting Earth. It forces us to confront the nature of memory and how reliable our recollections really are. It challenges us to consider whether conventional scientific methods are adequate for investigating subjective experiences that might involve non-physical or interdimensional elements. It asks us to balance skepticism with openness, to question extraordinary claims while respecting the genuine trauma of those making those claims. And perhaps most importantly, it demands that we acknowledge the limitations of our current understanding while remaining committed to seeking better explanations. Some experiencers have found ways to integrate their encounters into their lives, viewing them as transformative experiences that, despite their frightening nature, led to personal growth or spiritual insight. Others remain traumatized, their experiences an ongoing source of distress and confusion. Many have found support in communities of fellow experiencers, people who understand what they've gone through because they've experienced something similar. These support networks provide a space where people can discuss their experiences without fear of ridicule, where they can process their trauma with others who won't dismiss their accounts out of hand. The scientific and psychiatric communities remain divided about how to approach alien abduction claims. Some researchers, like the late Dr. John Mack at Harvard, argued that these experiences should be studied seriously and that experiencers' accounts deserve to be treated with respect and open-minded inquiry. Others maintain that abduction claims are best understood through conventional psychological and neurological frameworks, as sleep paralysis, false memories, fantasy-prone personality traits, or other well-documented phenomena that can create vivid but ultimately imaginary experiences. What seems clear is that the abduction phenomenon, whatever its ultimate cause, is not going away. New reports continue to emerge even as the cultural saturation of alien imagery might be expected to make people more skeptical. Some contemporary reports include elements that weren't common in earlier accounts, suggesting either that the phenomenon is evolving or that experiencers are being influenced by newer sources rather than older ones. The rise of the internet has made it easier for experiencers to connect with each other and with researchers, but it's also made it harder to separate genuine accounts from those influenced by online communities and the wealth of UFO content now available. If these experiences represent genuine contact with non-human intelligence, then we're faced with disturbing questions about the nature and purposes of that contact. Why would these beings conduct such procedures on humans? What do they hope to gain from their examinations and sample collections? Are they studying us, conducting genetic experiments, preparing for some larger purpose we can't yet understand? And most troubling of all, why do they operate in secret, taking people against their will rather than establishing open contact? If, on the other hand, these experiences are generated by human psychology and neurology, then we need to understand what's triggering such consistent patterns across so many individuals. Why do these particular imagery and themes recur so frequently? What is it about human consciousness that can generate such vivid and traumatic false memories? And how can we help people who are suffering genuine psychological distress from experiences they believe to be real, even if they're not? The cases we've explored tonight represent just a fraction of the thousands of abduction reports that have been documented over the past several decades. Each experiencer's story is unique, but they're united by the profound impact these events have had on their lives. Whether you believe these accounts represent literal alien contact, misinterpreted psychological or neurological phenomena, or something else entirely, the people reporting them deserve to have their experiences taken seriously and to receive support in dealing with the aftermath. As we conclude this exploration of disturbing UFO abduction cases, remember that behind every account is a real person whose life was changed by what they experienced. These aren't just stories to be consumed for entertainment or dismissed with easy skepticism. They're testimonies from people trying to make sense of experiences that challenged everything they thought they understood about the world. And whether the explanation ultimately proves to be extraterrestrial, psychological, or something we haven't even considered yet, their courage in sharing these experiences has expanded our collective conversation about what might be possible and what questions we should be asking about our place in the universe. So, the next time you look up at the stars on a clear night, consider that somewhere up there, or perhaps somewhere much closer than we think, there might be others looking back. And consider too that some of the people you pass on the street, ordinary people living ordinary lives, might carry within them memories of encounters that defy explanation, experiences that have marked them as witnesses to something beyond our current ability to fully understand. Their stories remind us that the universe is vast, our knowledge is limited, and the boundary between the known and the unknown remains tantalizingly thin. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of alleged alien abductions, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating content that explores the strange, the unexplained, and the mysteries that lie at the edges of human understanding. And remember, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, keeping an open mind while maintaining critical thinking is the best approach to these extraordinary claims. Sleep well, and may your dreams remain your own.